Welcome to the full version of our interview with senior researcher Mette Vaarst about the role of context-specific knowledge in agroecology.
What we were wondering a little bit about is how does agroecology then relate to this more traditional or practical and context-based knowledge? And it was interesting also because you have been working in different parts of the world. The way we understand agroecology, the way agroecology then develops in different contexts, does it vary in different countries, and how does that relate to the tradition?
Yeah, I think that the principles of agroecology builds on a context-based approach that's built into the principles of agroecology. And that does not mean that you cannot learn across different contexts. But the interesting thing is, I think, when you meet people who learn from each other, from different continents, for instance, or from different countries, or even from different regions within the same country, like the mountain areas and the lowland areas in Uganda, then they can learn from each other, but they always have to discuss in which context was this produced. So it's not that you cannot learn across contexts, but you have always to consider the context. So you don't have a one size fit all solution in any way. And that makes it very different from what I would call industrial agriculture, because industrial agriculture is built on the idea that you can move in both with the context and the things that should be in that context, so to speak. I come from an animal background professionally, and I mean, one of the areas that I can mention as this non-context based knowledge technology is like broiler production. I mean, that's completely industrialized, and you have the same type of units in Brazil, in India, in Europe. I mean, and you have the same animals, and that is very different from agroecology, where agroecology will always be built on what you have in the area, so that you don't you rely on your own resources, and you rely on making something that fits with your context, and so you generate the knowledge, and the context also changes. You cannot say just because you live in this region, then you live in this context, because I mean, with climate change, with all the changes that we see, with population pressure and everything, the context is also changing, and you have to learn in that context. You have to adjust to new things. So that's, I mean, agroecology, I think one of the very attractive things about agroecology is that it requires knowledge people who are ready to learn and learn together and co-create knowledge. And I think that, I mean, the reason why I say it's attractive is that I think it's really stimulating, and I think that it's also stimulating for the people who are there, and they can take ownership over the development.
Before you mentioned Uganda, so I'm guessing you've had some projects down there.
Yeah.
What would be the approach, for example, when you go there? Do you go with some ideas on how things should work and how could they improve what they're doing?
No, I go with my luggage that is also, like, what can you say, the agroecological organic permaculture principles. I mean, I see principles like very like in the same family, but let's say I go with my agroecology principles in my luggage and try to discuss how can this make sense in this context. So I don't have any techniques, but I have I'm participating in a co-creation process, you could say. And then what I participate with in the projects I've been working with in Uganda is mostly also on the social structures. We have been working with something called farmer family learning groups, and that's something that, I mean, that's just an approach where families, where households are going together and working together and talking about gendered approaches. You can also say that is also where you build on an approach where the knowledge from the men and the women and the children and the elders are like valued.
But do you see different trends also? So something your luggage from Denmark, let's say, that doesn't work in Uganda, or vice versa?
Do you mean like technical knowledge about way of managing soil or something, or
I'm thinking about because you came with these principles, right?
Yeah.
That these principles in Denmark, for instance, have a whole different context than in Uganda. Do you? I mean, the principles can be the same, but do you see them that they might not work in Denmark, or I mean, there's a whole different dynamics, I guess, in Uganda.
Completely different dynamics. It's different social dynamics. I mean, where I've been working. So that alone, I have to learn. I think I have learned incredibly much working with people from Uganda. I mean, about also seeing my own context in another way. But I mean, the whole issue of cultural division of work, but also how it is to work culturally in another setting where there's been a lot of migration also, for instance. That's one thing, but seen from an agricultural point of view, I mean, coming from a place, for instance, where we have summer and winter, and a tradition to store things, and coming to a place where storage is not an option because then it rots, and then you have to keep the cycle going all the time. I mean, that's a really challenge to also sink into your way of thinking of having agricultural systems where you are growing all year round. How do you get how do you kind of introduce rest and growth and so on? So it's like, then I have to learn something about how can we do that. I mean, another example is I have some bees in Denmark, and that is a completely special rhythm of having bees because they are wintered and so on. In Uganda, they have a completely different ways of approaching bees because, I mean, bees should be active all year round, and they are so it's like, I mean, there's a lot of things where you can say we can have some principles about we should try to support natural cycles, but the natural cycles are just different in a country that doesn't have winters from a country that have winters, for instance.
What I'm wondering a little bit in connection to what Jeroen was asking is, for example, arriving in a context where they might have issues of lack of nutrients in the soil. How does the traditional knowledge in that case play a role when maybe, I don't know, one solution to producing more, if that's one of the issues, could be, for example, by applying fertilizer?
Yeah. And that is actually a very interesting point, because there we can see that the change in context is really playing a role. In the area, I've worked in a specific mountainous area in Uganda for about 10 years. And in that area, the population pressure has really increased over the last couple of decades. And there you can see the traditional knowledge has been much more slash and burn like. And that worked when you are not that many people, because you can let areas just rest. But when the population pressure increases, you have to find ways of fertilizing the soil to keep it going. And there you can say, when we have an interaction, but it's not just me, it's definitely other organizations in Uganda and so on that are coming in with their knowledge about how can we apply mulch, compost, how can we work with these cycles. So for sure, there you can say traditional knowledge is actually not applicable in that. You have to have local knowledge, you have to have local knowledge generation, but you cannot use the traditional knowledge of how you moved around and had the families did not move that much around, but they just took different pieces of land in use. And they have a completely, and I can still not explain that, but the whole land issue and who have the right to grow what pieces of land is beyond my understanding, because that's very complex. But it's now they have much more like structured plots, and they have to keep them going to grow food enough.
So in the end, it goes a little bit back to what you were saying before, that it's a lot about co-creation of also new knowledge.
Yeah.
So you use the local context as a starting point, but you can create also new knowledge based on, for example, new technologies or new scientific understanding that we can develop also within agroecology.
Exactly.
But it's also in a constant dynamic world. I mean, we have the climate change, we have migrations, booming population maybe in some areas.
Yeah. And I mean, and we have a big challenge, I think, also in, I mean, this, talking about migration, because that was another thing that we experienced, that, I mean, a lot of the men had actually moved out of the area and gradually came back when the opportunities became better, for instance, for farming and actually producing food. But we are in a challenging world with, unemployment, a huge amount of young people who are unemployed in some continents, at least, and so on. So, I mean, how do we adjust to that? And how do we also, I think that we all have to change minds, for instance, like having rural-urban interfaces, like much more than we used to have, to start thinking about how can we make whole food systems so that we still base it on principles of agroecology, but it's like and there the traditional, you could say the traditional thinking for many years, at least in Denmark, with food production in the countryside and city life also has to be challenged, I think, and where we have to start thinking, okay, we have different zones, and we could maybe have, like, what can you say, corridors or tunnels, and we could have urban agriculture for fresh food, we could have indoor, outdoor, we could, we have to rethink things, and their traditional knowledge and new co-created knowledge has to play a big role, and every context has to find its own like way, its own mode.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, also from that exchange of emails with Jan, it's true. I mean, what is traditional, and it is an interesting conversation to have. So it's not about having one box and saying this is how it is, but it's
how I see traditional actually is the knowledge that has been gained over the years, and the local knowledge, I would say. That's how I define traditional.
And I think that one of the keywords is also that when you talk about local knowledge and diversity, I mean, diverse knowledge is also, I mean, to keep having co-creation and exchange, you have to have a diversity of experiences and standpoints. And in that sense, it always makes sense to bring people together from different contexts. Something happens when you bring people together from different contexts. I mean, first of all, they start exchanging their experiences and try to understand it in their different contexts. But they also, each of them, see their own context much more clearly, because you mirror, I mean, you kind of contrast and mirror in your mind. That was interesting. I didn't think about this before.
About the gender shift is actually something that we discussed when we were writing the text to send you.
Yeah.
You're like, okay, now we are going to ask Mette about traditional knowledge and Jan about technology. Is it like something that we are also making in a gendered way?
Well, I don't know. I ask as many questions as you do, but I mean, my observation seen from a Danish perspective is that the division of work between men and women were completely different in the time before technology moved in.
Okay.
So that was so that was, I mean, it was the women's job, for instance, to manage everything that had to do with milk. They were the dairies. I mean, they were the dairy women, and they were apprentices in each other's estates and so on. You could apply for getting a kind of education as an apprentice, and then you worked for free for a couple of years and learned it, and then you were really highly valued as somebody who had special skills and could do that. And then, I mean, the technologies took more and more over, and together with, and in my understanding, when the centrifuge, for instance, moved in and was invented, and you could make new technologies in the dairy, and at the same time you had this corporate movement starting taking on in the late 1800s, then women were more and more excluded, so to speak, from all kind of processes around dairy products, butter and cheese and so on. So then it became a man's work. And I think that I've been following, and that's not so much in Denmark, because seed saving in Denmark is very much on a hobby level at the moment. But if you follow seed savers around the world, very many women are involved in seed saving. That's just who I have met. It's only my personal experience. I don't have any statistics about it. But I mean, when I have had discussions about seed saving, for instance, in Uganda, if I followed seed guardians, all kind of seed savers, I mean, it's many men and many women. So I think
these are agricultural seeds, or in general,
yeah, mostly. I mean, all kind of crops, grains, the whole potato, like saving in Bolivia and Ecuador, and I think that it's food. It's food.
Food,
yeah.
If for the short version you were to say, how is agroecology employing context-specific knowledge? What would you say?
I would say, well, agroecology is based on principles where you don't have a one-size-fits-all solution to anything. Everything happens in a context, and therefore local knowledge and context-based knowledge is very important. And the context is not just an area or just a social context, but it's also a time-based context. So things develop over time. So you always have to develop new knowledge to fit to that special context. And you can still exchange knowledge with people from another context, because actually bringing together different contexts may create very interesting reflections that actually help everybody in their own context also with applying these principles in practice.
Good, but thank you so much.
Very welcome.